All right. I have been promising to do this segment for so long. I'm finally going to do it. We're going to talk about state and local financing. Okay. So a couple weeks ago, I did a story on Buffalo, the city of Buffalo. By the way, yes, it's in Erie County. I'm sorry. I didn't know at the time. We know now. We're good. Anyway, the point of me bringing that up is because it was a situation where I talked about how cities don't have a ton of money floating around. And that's true. So let's think about how a city is funded. We'll work on a state later, but let's talk about a city for now. To any city, all done pretty much the same way. So the majority of the revenue, the tax revenue coming into a city comes in April during tax day, right? People file their taxes, cities get a majority of their tax revenue from that point forward, okay? But the city has to plan a budget for the entire year, right? So what does the city do if it needs more money than it has coming in? Because even though it's a large cash flow, the city doesn't always have a place it can kind of store that money until it needs it, or it uses the influx of money to address, insufficiencies that it's having in that moment. Now, before I proceed, it's important to remember that the United States Constitution does not allow for states, equivalent of provinces, for those of you who are not tuning in from the US, or cities to go into debt, okay? So we get into this weird situation where a city cannot actually go to a bank and borrow money and say, hey, we would love to do X, Y, and Z, and in order to do that, we need money. We don't have that money. Can we borrow the money from you? Because this would force the city to go into debt, and it is illegal for cities to go into debt. Personally, I don't think it should be, but I'll get to that later. So what does the city do? Well, one of the things that cities can do, and if you live in a city, you know that cities do this, they can start imposing fines and fees, and they can create ordinances which essentially are easy to break and there are little fines for. So for example, I live in the city of Philadelphia. If you are parked illegally, you get and it's not having to do with a fire hydrant or an intersection with a specific label on it, the fine is $26, okay? Oh, where a bus is. So the fine is $26. So every time you park illegally, you have to pay $26. Now, in a city of millions of people like Philadelphia is, there are lots of people who probably bake this on a regular basis. And the city uses those fees to pay for the agency who actually is ticking the meters and check and giving out the fines. By the way, if you violate a meter, also $26 fine. But either way, so they use that money to pay for the agency, but then they use any money that's left on top of it to help fund the city. Okay, so that's just parking, but you know that there are a variety of situations where it's illegal to do this, that, and the other thing without a license, permit, whatever. And all those licenses and permits and zoning certificates and yada 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 yada. That's all revenue, right? The city brings that in, but it's not really enough. And the city then has to kind of find interesting ways to get more money so that it has it year round. So cities have devised something very interesting, but also very dangerous. By the way, this essentially works the same way at the state level, but there are different considerations, which is why I'm going to talk about that one separately. So at the city level, they create bonds, and they sell these bonds to banks. The banks buy the bonds for a certain amount of money. Now, if you don't know how a bond works, essentially, when you buy a bond, you give money to someone and you say, hey, you can have this money, but in X number of years or in X number of months or in X number of time periods, you need to give me that money back, or you need to sell that bond back to me. But because I'm letting you borrow this money, because I need an incentive to sell this to you, to buy this from you, to buy the bond from you, you need to give me interest on that money, right? So if I'm a bank, say Philadelphia has $100 million worth of bonds. So as a bank, I say, I'm willing to buy your $100 million worth of bonds, which, by the way, gives the bank the bonds and gives the city the cash, right? But I'm not going to buy this bond unless you give me a 1% interest rate. So in April, we'll pretend it's like July or something. In April, when you get all your tax revenue, I want the 100 million back plus my 1% interest on that, so $101 million. Okay? And the city says sure, because the city knows roughly from projections. Now, I'm just making up these numbers, of course, but the city roughly knows from projections on taxable income about how much money it's going to have each April when it gets a massive dump of money, okay, from the taxpayers. So the city then agrees to sell the bonds to these interested stakeholders, and they negotiate for what those interest rates should be. Now, oftentimes a city will have just predetermined what the interest rate will be. It doesn't really matter. There's an interest rate on top of it. That money is not flowing freely, okay? But because of the way that bonds can be sold, the city can essentially sell bonds anytime it needs money. However, the promise, of course, is when tax day comes and the city gets all this money, they then have to pay back all their creditors. But they're not technically creditors because the city isn't borrowing money. It's not going into debt. But you can see how it's effectively the same thing, right? There is money exchanged, there's a repayment period, and there's interest involved. It is effectively a loan, but because it legally is not a loan, cities can do it, okay? Now, the thing that's very interesting about this is that this is a situation that works really great for cities for the most part. However, if for some reason the amount of tax revenue coming in does not equal the amount owed by the bondholders, well, guess what? The city cannot borrow money, because it is illegal for it to borrow money. So it has to cut places. And we all know that when a city cuts places, it typically cuts from those who need it most. So the thing about this that's so problematic is that this can become a vicious cycle. You have one bad year, and the city is suddenly in a terrible position. And by the way, the banks know this, where the city has to continue to sell bonds for higher and higher interest rates. And of course, it then gets into more and more debt, but it's not really debt, right? So you get into this weird situation where cities have to be bailed out, even though technically they were never in debt in the first place. Same thing happens with states. So what is the solution here, right? Well, the first and what hopefully should be the most obvious solution is, well, we should just make sure that cities and states can borrow money. Perfect. Love it. Who are they going to borrow from? Banks. So there are a couple options here. One is they can be allowed to borrow banks, but the federal government could put a cap on how much interest the banks can charge. Or there is the bank that the states borrow from could be the Fed Bank, could be the US Treasury, and they could pay interest back to the United States government, with the United States government having the option to say, hey, actually, we're going to cancel your debt at any time, right? The Congress could write a law that says states and cities can borrow money. They can only borrow it from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve will lend it to them at a rate no higher than blank, and at the at the pleasure of the Fed chair, the states and the city's debt can be wiped clean if it's found in the the financial interest of the United States government to do that, right? They could do that. Or the other thing that they could do is essentially you could borrow that money from the government for free. So the United States government produces money, right? That's one of the main jobs that it does. It produces money when it needs it. Now, of course, I've talked about modern monetary theory on the show multiple times, but essentially this is where modern monetary theory could shine. Essentially, a city could say to the federal government, or a state could say to the federal government, we have a budget shortfall of X amount. We want to do Y. Can we have X amount of money? The government could literally just print the money and give it to the state or city to use. And that way, they never have to borrow the money. And there's never any obligation for a payback to occur because the money is essentially free to them. Now, of course, you might be worried that, oh my gosh, if we give all this money to cities and states, they're going to do all sorts of crazy things and there'll be no accountability and they'll just spend and the government will just give them. Well, fair enough. You could put limits on what level or what types of things the government could give that money for. Now, by the way, before you think this is a good idea, it's actually quite dangerous because essentially you will make this into a partisan game. Okay, and especially because the decision about this would be made at the executive level. You essentially have any president who could essentially decide on a whim what they do and don't like states spending money on, which truthfully is the worst idea. We don't want this. But you can also say that states can only get a maximum of X amount of dollars, right? You could limit the ways in which states could acquire this money. That way, making sure that no matter what, even though the money is interest-free and the money is essentially free to the state, you don't have to worry about a situation where it's out of control because eventually the government just says, we're no longer interested in funding you past a certain amount. And, you know, there are plenty of ways to do it. And I'm sure people much smarter than me have figured ways to do it. But you first have to get over this hurdle. The reason I've been meaning to talk about this for so long is because cities and states are effectively doing the thing they're barred from doing in the first place. And this conversation is a really nuanced one, and there's lots of information here, you know, that people don't really know about how cities and states manage their finances. But if we change the posture of the government such that we allow for cities and states to do the thing they're essentially already doing, but we make that thing safer for them, we are likely going to improve all of our interactions with local government. And I include states and local government here. So I hope this has been informative. I hope you learned something about how cities and states manage their finances. I hope you have thought about the solution. And by the way, if you're active in your local governing body or whatever, ask them about this, right? Ask them how much money they get in bonds versus how much comes in through taxes. And then spread the word. Think about ways that we can stop this predatory behavior from banks to cities and states who are essentially forced to take this really convoluted route to do the same thing that they're prohibited from doing.
Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. Alright guys, see you next time. Bye for now.